From WBEZ Chicago, it's This American Life, distributed by Public Radio International. I am hoping that all this sounds so crazy you just might stay with us. Back one, Mr. Holland's opus. Okay, true story. The guy goes to college on a music scholarship, and then afterwards he ends up going into science, and he becomes a cancer researcher. His name is John Brody. And 19 years after graduating, John is invited back to his old college to give a talk about his work. And the speech he gives is mainly about how important it's been in his research to think outside the box, to use an overused phrase, to think outside the box, to be ready to turn away from what's familiar and try some new idea. And then after his speech, John is approached by his old orchestra teacher, a guy named Anthony Holland. And Professor Holland, to John's great surprise, says, you know, speaking of thinking outside the box, I've actually been working on an experiment for a few years that I'd like to show you. Come look at this video. I think you'll find it very interesting. So, what can John do? He just actually given a whole talk about keeping an open mind. What resulted from this was the kind of scientific collaboration that almost never, ever happens. A serious cancer researcher teaming up with an amateur to try to make a breakthrough. Gabriel Rhodes is a documentary filmmaker, and he's been following the story from the beginning, back when John watched that video. Here's Gabriel.
I've seen the video that Anthony, the orchestra teacher, showed John, and it amazed me. I saw single-cell organisms, basically round and oblong and pear-shaped blobs, swimming around under a microscope. Anthony narrates this as he goes along, and suddenly the cells stop and just self-destruct.
Look what happened just now. He suddenly and dramatically disintegrated.
Some burst into tiny fragments, and some look like a plastic bag that's been punctured, and their contents leak out. As Anthony explained to John, the theory behind what he was doing was simple. You know how a singer, if they hit the right frequency, can shatter a crystal glass? Well, Anthony was basically doing the same thing, directing specific frequencies at microorganisms, like bacteria and protozoa, to try and shatter them. And after a year and a half of experimentation, suddenly it worked. So Anthony showed this to John, and he and John each remember the conversation that followed a little differently, in a way that says a lot about their later collaboration. Anthony's version was entirely optimistic.
He immediately jumped right to the main thing that I was interested in, and he just said, do you think you can shatter cancer cells like that?
And here's John.
You know, when I first heard about it, it's in the arena of UFOs, for sure. You know, he was putting words in my mouth already. He was saying things like, you know, he would say, do you think this would work? And I was like, you know, I would say, well, you know, it's a possibility, and, you know, I'm willing to try anything. And so Anthony would go, he would, you know, in his voice, he would say, so you're saying that I could maybe cure cancer? And I was like, well, so could the oboe player downstairs.
But John was willing to talk more, in part because he's so frustrated with cancer research. He thinks it's stalled. Lots of people going over the same familiar ideas, endlessly refining the same concepts, because the familiar is more likely to get funded.
You know, I do think it's much like being out in Hollywood, where, you know, you might go out to Hollywood thinking that you're going to be Kafka, and you might end up writing, you know, the worst, hackiest sitcom in the world, right? Because you want to survive. So what happens in this country when the same thing happens with science?
I've known John Brody for 20 years. He's a good friend of mine. And before this encounter, Anthony was just a professor who drove him really hard back when he went to college on a percussion scholarship. They weren't close or anything, but John definitely remembered Professor Holland, as he'd always known him.
He probably wouldn't say this, but I sort of remember him as, I think he was disappointed in me as a musician in the orchestra, because I remember him wanting to have like extra sessions with me. And I think when we had a guest composer come in, I hate to say it, like, I think he relegated me to like playing the triangle. And I'm not kidding. I seriously remember having to count like 67 bars to hit that one quarter note on the triangle.
So when Anthony came up to him after his speech, John was flattered that this teacher he'd always respected was interested in his work. They started emailing back and forth about Anthony's video and his experiments, until finally John decided that he couldn't tell whether Anthony had something serious that could be researched, unless he drove up to see him. So he went, and he invited me along just as a fun road trip. And why not film the conversation while I'm there?
Is there enough light? I'm worried about the light.
Oh, yeah. We're up at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York, where Anthony teaches. Anthony's in his early 50s, but he's got a boyish vibe. He bounces a little when he walks. Full head of brown hair, goatee, glasses, corduroys. Your basic professor. John's in his late 30s, balding but in that stylish, close-cropped way. He stays in shape, even though he works like a maniac. And over the course of their long conversation, John was surprised and impressed by how much Anthony knew, how much he'd read, how dogged he'd been in his experiments. And one thing in particular caught John's attention. In Anthony's experiments, particular frequencies seemed to target particular organisms and left others untouched, meaning there might be frequencies that could destroy cancer cells while leaving normal, healthy cells alone. A potential solution, John said, to the biggest problem with most cancer treatments.
So if we can find a frequency specific to cancer cells, you could put someone in a room and you hit that frequency and it's not affecting normal cells. I mean, that's the actual perfect paradigm in which to treat someone for this disease. Because what kills a patient is not the primary tumor, it's the tumors that have left the site and gone off into neighborhoods that the surgeon can't take out. So if you could walk into a room and you can get completely zapped,
Right.
like a complete CAT scan,
Right, and
or
it
an
only
MRI,
hits the cancer. It doesn't hurt
Right.
healthy cells. Yeah, that would be the...
home run.
That's the dream.
Yeah.
That's the dream because chemotherapy and radiation are so flawed. Both of them can cause cancer as well as treat it. Both devastate healthy cells. Anthony's machine works by pulsing the cells with electromagnetic waves at specific frequencies. And there are other scientists out there, published in peer-reviewed journals, who are also using electromagnetic waves to attack cancer cells. There's an FDA clinical trial going on right now using this method. The whole field is still very new, just a handful of people, and Anthony's system is different from others. But using electromagnetic waves to target cancer cells isn't just a fantasy dreamed up by a music professor. Then John asked Anthony how he'd gotten into these experiments in the first place.
I read an interesting book called Lost Science. And I'm very interested in hidden information and secret and stuff we're not supposed to know, and things maybe that were known a long time ago were forgotten or something. And in that book, now this is where it probably gets very kind of controversial, but I read about a guy named Royal Raymond Rife. And the book says that in the 1930s, he built a electromagnetic frequency device, a radio frequency device, which cured cancer. I got the device. I developed a special custom-built frequency synthesis program because that's what I teach, digital audio synthesis, and I've been studying sound and physics and acoustics for a long time. And I began to run frequencies through this device.
Now, Royal Rife, for lots of people who have even heard of him, is a name synonymous with bogus cancer cures. He was an inventor in the 1930s. And the legend is that he cured a bunch of people with cancer using an electromagnetic wave device before he was destroyed by a greedy mainstream medical establishment. It's a staple of conspiracy theory websites. Google him. He's everywhere. If John wanted out of the box, Anthony and the Rife machine were way outside. And John and Anthony were just an unlikely pair. John was the head of his own lab by the age of 40. He gets hundreds of thousands of dollars from the National Institutes of Health and other very mainstream medical research organizations. Anthony, meanwhile, is a composer, electronics whiz, a self-taught expert in several fields, and a deep skeptic of all things mainstream, especially in medicine. He pulled me aside more than once to warn me I better be careful, my life might be in danger, because big pharmaceutical companies would try to hush up any story about a possible cancer treatment alternative. But they decided to work together, and it was just as much a personal decision as anything else. Each of them saw something in the other. They liked each other. And John thought, who cares where the electromagnetic wave theory came from? It's a potentially game-changing treatment. Why not at least test it? So he invited Anthony to come down to his lab in Philadelphia with the device. And they agreed to keep everything as low stakes as possible. Half serious, half a lark. Anthony would come for only 2 weeks. And they'd see what happened.
This is the miracle amplifier, the secret weapon.
Anthony is in a room at John's lab at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, unpacking his equipment. And the plan for the next 2 weeks is that Anthony will work at night after everyone else leaves, so he isn't taking time or space away from other experiments. And he has to pay his own way. No tax dollars or grant money will be spent on this. John will supervise. So here Anthony is, surrounded by amplifiers, cables, all sorts of equipment, none of which is in special cases or anything. It's all coming out of luggage, wrapped in bubble wrap. And into this room where they do molecular cloning. It's got microscopes, a big medical-grade incubator, a special sterile area called the tissue culture hood. It's high-tech. John's watching Anthony assembling his gear.
It looks like you literally made this in your garage.
John said, "It looks like you literally made this in your garage." To me, the setup looks like it was designed by Dr. Seuss for some sci-fi movie in the 60s. There's some high-tech gear like a big glass helium-filled tube with electrodes that glows pink when it's turned on. And then this whole mess of consumer electronics.
This is a power supply that came from an electronics house in Cleveland. And then this little 100-watt magical amp I picked up from some company that sells CB radios to truckers or something on the internet.
There's also 2 laptops, and on one, Anthony's written a program that generates frequencies to send into the device. It sounds like this.
It's not a really fabulous sound. It's kind of ugly and annoying.
Yeah. And then a transmitter transposes the frequencies way up out of the audible range.
And then what we'll do is we'll set the cancer cells right here. And with any luck, if we get the right frequency, the cancer cells may in fact start dying.
For the next 2 weeks, Anthony works all night, every night, running experiments, taking cancer cells that have been prepared for him out of the incubator, and he pulses the cells with frequencies for hours, trying one frequency after another. John checks in on the experiments every day. There's a lot of trial and error and problems. Some of the equipment blows out and has to be replaced. And John and Anthony aren't sure what they've got until Anthony's last day, when John comes to look at the latest experiments.
Let's see, they're going to be labeled 720.
They're sitting in front of a microscope looking down at pancreatic cancer cells. The cells are in what looks like a tiny plastic egg carton. John looks down into the microscope, and he starts to get excited.
This is pretty surprising to me.
Really?
Yeah.
A huge percentage of the pancreatic cells that Anthony pulsed with his device are dead. They combined the pulsing with a tiny bit of chemo, and of the cancer cells that Anthony pulsed, only 10% are still alive. A separate group of cells that he did not pulse has 60% alive. And this comparison is the key to the whole thing. In any experiment, you have the cells that you treat and the ones that you don't treat, which are called the control group. Comparing the treated cells to the control is the only way you can tell if something's working. Again, here, only 10% of the pulsed cells survived, versus 60% of the control cells. It's a dramatic result. John gives everything to the lab tech, Christina, to count up the cells in a precise way, do the quantitative analysis.
I mean, when she quantitates these, we're going to have a beautiful graph.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, a beautiful graph.
A beautiful graph, that's code for John is thrilled. Pancreatic cancer is his specialty, and it's practically invincible. Harder to kill than other cancers. So tough that even chemo, which is poison, often barely works at all. Over the last 25 years, the biggest treatment breakthrough only added about 4 months to a patient's life. John starts going through his mental checklist of potential problems with the experiment. This is what he does when he's excited about new results. And he checks with Anthony about the controls.
That's all you did to these things. And you took these out of the incubator, the others out? The controls did you take out?
No, the controls I left in the incubator. I know I probably should take them out for the 6 or 7 hours that I'm treating them, but
yeah, I thought you were doing that. I mean, that's why that first day I was asking you to do that.
Right.
John's expression doesn't change much, but the experiment is now a wash. The cells that Anthony was pulsing sat outside the incubator for hours at a time while he was pulsing them. Therefore, the control plates also had to sit outside the incubator for the exact same amount of time. Otherwise, they don't count as controls. It was an amateur's mistake, and of course Anthony is an amateur. But getting the controls exactly right turns out to be one of the hardest parts of any experiment. So even though Anthony's 2 weeks are up, he has to leave today, they've got to do the experiments again. The first chance Anthony has to go back to John's lab is 6 months later. It's a whole day's drive. He's on a sabbatical, so he can be here for 5 weeks this time. I visit him about 3 weeks in.
You ask me how it's going. It's like the tale of two cities. It's going really great on one hand, and it's going really badly on the other hand. It's going really great because we have absolute proof, and we'll see what John says later today when we see him, but we're blowing cancer cells away.
This is how Anthony sees it, because night after night, he's watching cancer cells die and taking thousands of time-lapse photos and videos as it happens, like the video that he first showed John. The problem is, these photos are not absolute proof at all. Not to any scientist, not to John. Cancer cells die for all kinds of reasons. Absolute proof means only one thing: counting the cells in the experiments, the treated ones and the control groups, and comparing them. So while Anthony might think they have proof, John would never say that. In these last 3 weeks, Anthony's had a series of setbacks. Basically, the photos are all he's got from a bunch of experiments that had to be thrown out. But finally, he starts to get incredible results. John gave him leukemia cells for the first time, and the pulsing seems to have killed 30% more of the cancer cells compared with the controls.
You're doing something to these.
Oh yeah,
You're doing.
I have video.
We can get quantitation on this.
Really? Hey, if we can get quantitative numbers out of this, I'll keep hammering these guys.
John turns to Anthony and starts going through his mental checklist. Again, he's excited. He's thinking that maybe, if everything's right, these results are good enough to publish in a paper.
2 or 3 nights.
Yeah, Anthony, I'm serious about this.
Yeah.
You need to think about, for me,
Yeah.
like anything I've done for you,
Yeah.
you need to think about, is there any, these plates just sit out here,
Yeah.
and then you bring the other plate in there.
Right.
And there's nothing different that you do to those plates.
Nope.
Except for the
Just electronic pulsing.
because if we publish this, it's like, your name will go first, my name will go last. It's our names on the line.
No, I think I
We're
should.
married together.
Yeah, I understand that.
So
and, I think
our
I should be like
reputation is married.
I should be a technical footnote at the end. You know, thanks to Anthony Holland for assistance. You know,
I think that's absurd.
I would.
That's one of the most absurd comments you've made
Really?
since I've known you.
Well,
And you've made a few.
that's okay with me. I mean that.
Careful here.
A couple days later, I talked to John up on the roof of his apartment building. They're still waiting for the numbers, the analysis. But now they've got both leukemia and pancreatic experiments that they're fired up about.
I mean, they're astounding results and sort of unprecedented. There could be a lot of reasons behind it besides the pulsing, and that's why we need to reproduce it. What makes me nervous and anxious is if I'm truly the only cancer researcher using this apparatus since Royal Rife, because, again, that puts even more pressure on me to publish something that's real. And of course, I want it to work. It's potentially something very exciting, but it's still very much up in the air.
Anthony's in a very different place.
Somewhere over the rainbow. Yeah, I kind of feel like that. We're living in Oz right now because we're doing the impossible. What happened? What was Oz all about? Oz was all about Dorothy goes to a wonderful place where miracles happen. That's where I am. Because we're proving the impossible. We're proving that a Rife machine kills cancer. We're not proving, it's been proven. The question is, how much proof can we pile up now for other people? As John said, no one's going to believe it. Well, the rest of my life, no matter what anybody says, I know it works.
By the end of August, a year since they started this process, Anthony's done 2 rounds of experiments, and he's about to finish a final round. The plan is for Anthony to reproduce the great leukemia and pancreatic results one more time, with perfect controls, including a special kind of control called a sham. John has asked Anthony to start writing up a paper to submit for publication while he's finishing the experiments. And he's more confident about the project than I've ever seen him.
Just to let you know where I'm at, I'm excited about finishing this paper, putting my name on the paper. I'm willing to put my name out there so much that I'll be the senior author, the last author. And I'm willing to send in an NIH grant. I don't know if we'll get it together for October. So this will be, 6-page, $250,000 grant to pursue this work with Anthony. And I'm willing to, I believe it so much that we're starting to administratively think about it and move this forward. If these controls work out well, his therapy's working at this stage of the game. And, I wouldn't have predicted that. I know I'm going to get criticism about it. I know they're like, what are you doing? What is this? Do you really believe this stuff? I'm very serious about my reputation, and, some scientists don't have an open mind. I'm definitely nervous about that aspect.
Hello, Jonathan. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Very good.
And then, bad news. Really bad news. I'm up at Skidmore with Anthony when John calls with the data about the final round of experiments. At first, they talk about the Excel spreadsheet with data from the control experiment called a sham. There was a bit of a strange result there. But the real bad news comes when John asks Anthony to open up the PowerPoint presentation and look at the data from the pancreatic experiments.
PowerPoint. Let's see. Room temperature. Whoa. What is this PowerPoint of?
Well, the pulsing basically caused the cells to become resistant to the drugs, and they grew better.
This is really weird because it's very opposite of what we saw in previous experiments.
Yeah.
It's a disaster. It's a huge setback. It's shocking. The data show that in the plate of treated pancreatic cells, the ones pulsed with electromagnetic waves and given a tiny dose of chemo, 100% of the cancer cells were alive after treatment. Meaning, not only did the pulsing not kill any cancer cells, but somehow the pulsing seemed to protect the cancer cells from being killed by the chemo. Anthony is stunned. He keeps saying the same thing again and again.
All the other experiments show completely different results. I don't understand that. It doesn't make any sense to me.
It's a slap in the face, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll go through stepwise, okay? Because there's some things we definitely need to discuss here. So
they talk for 45 minutes, going over every aspect of the experiment. Anthony had used a different microscope this time. Maybe that was a problem. The microscope light that Anthony used when he took time-lapse photos of the experiments, was the light heating the cells? And the amp for the device had been outputting less power than usual. Maybe some of the components were damaged. But the upshot of these last experiments is different for John and Anthony. Anthony sees these results as a fluke, an outlier. The other results still seem valid to him. But for John, there's only one truth. If they want to publish, they've got to do more experiments. Anthony has to reproduce and confirm those great earlier results with controls.
For me, doing this for 20 some odd years or whatever it is, or, it doesn't surprise me that it's going to be this complicated. But, I'm in it for the long haul as far as the collaboration is to try to figure this out. And we'll just keep at it, okay?
Okay.
But that wasn't what happened. In fact, for an entire year, John wasn't sure what was going on, and neither was I. He offered to go up to Skidmore to set up a lab for Anthony there if he couldn't come back down to Philadelphia, but that didn't happen. And then Anthony became very hard to reach. A couple of weeks after John talked to Anthony by phone for the first time in several months, I go and see John. He's decided to go up to Saratoga the following week to talk to Anthony face-to-face about the experiment. In the last year, John's become more of a skeptic. Partly about the device itself, but also about the collaboration with Anthony. Why would Anthony just drop out like this?
If he really believes in it, and he really believes those results, let's do it again. If you cured cancer cells, let's do it again. My lab is open. My lab is open. My expertise is open. I'm happy. You don't want to do it in Philadelphia? Let's do it in Saratoga. Ask him, why hasn't he taken me up on that? I mean, if let me ask you a question. If you knew you had something that killed cancer cells, right, and you believed in it, you really believed in it, you could wait a year to try to prove that because one set of experiments didn't work? I mean, come on.
This is one of the big differences between John and Anthony, between scientist and non-scientist. For John, having a year's worth of work suddenly thrown into question is a normal day at the office. But for Anthony, that's not normal, and it's not okay. The time in John's lab was a year of his life, where he felt like John kept moving the goalposts. I felt that way too sometimes as I was watching. John kept saying he was amazed at what he was seeing, and just about convinced. But then he'd wake up in the middle of the night with another experiment or control that he wanted to run. And there was no telling when it would end, which for him, again, is normal. But now Anthony wants to know, before he starts turning his life upside down again, what will count as proof enough for John? How many experiments?
So let's say I do 3 weeks of experiment and I only concentrate on these leukemia cells, and if I can kill at least 20% every single time, every week, will that do it? Would that be enough? Or do you want to see pancreatic die, or do you want to see ovarian? I mean, what exact buttons do I have to hit?
When John gets to Saratoga, he and Anthony embrace and smile, and they're clearly glad to see each other. But as soon as they start talking about the experiments, they start arguing, and they don't understand each other. John keeps coming back to the same point.
Why can't you accept that we haven't proven anything? In the court of scientific law, we haven't proven anything.
But we have very intriguing results.
That's fine. I mean, if you want to leave it at that, you could say that. But, there's a big difference between intriguing and promising results and actually showing and demonstrating that something works. There's a huge difference. So 10 years from now, would you still walk around campus and be like, you know what? I killed those cancer cells. I actually did that. I actually proved that this worked. Do you think deep down that's the way you feel? That's what I want to know.
We're not just talking about the last experiment, right? We're talking about the whole thing.
Yeah.
In general?
Yeah.
Are you kidding? I would frame this chart showing 43% of the leukemia cells dead, and I would say,
Anthony,
we nailed them.
Let me ask you a question. If you're sitting on the cure for cancer, why aren't we doing the experiments?
I can't afford it.
So you're telling me, you're willing to say to the world that you think you have the cure for cancer, but you can't afford it?
Yeah.
Anthony says he's run out of money. He spent 6 years, including the time he worked on his own with protozoa, putting his own money into these experiments. Equipment, travel, living expenses while he was at John's lab. Many, many thousands of dollars. He won't say exactly how much. And then after he got back from the last round of experiments at John's lab, it was like he was looking up from the microscope at his life for the first time in a while.
I tell you, I came home from that year, and I just look at the house, and I just see like, oh my God, I lost track of what's going on here. We need a new roof on the house, and we've got a huge leak in the bathroom. The plumbing's all screwed up, and I've been making too many sacrifices.
John doesn't offer to fund another round of experiments. He's got a tight budget, and at this point, like I said, he's not feeling so hopeful about Anthony and his experiment. He's more optimistic about the 30-plus other experiments he's got moving ahead in his lab. And Anthony refuses to ask for money to proceed. He says that would be rude. But he says he may have a different solution to the money problem. He starts showing John his new website for his new nonprofit company called
Novo Biotronics Incorporated, the future of biotechnology research. I mean, a lot of dramatic statements, but
apparently for the past year, Anthony's been forming this nonprofit company and building the website. which has tabs for all the different research he hopes to do with the device. Not just cancer, but also Lyme disease, malaria. He doesn't get into the malaria or any part of that with John, but he does show him the pages and pages where he explains in detail the cancer experiments they've done, without mentioning John's name or the name of his lab, since he doesn't have permission. Anthony says his plan is to use the website to raise money so they can continue the experiments. I thought John might be angry. Why hadn't Anthony told him that this is what he'd been doing all year? But John's reaction is,
I mean, this is amazing. I wish that all the students or the graduate students or, people or the scientists that believed in what they were doing took this sort of initiative.
Wow. That's nice to hear.
I think it's a beautiful website, Anthony. I think it's great. I think my only concern is, again, which is my overall concern of where things are at, is you have to be really careful here. That really a trained eye or a trained scientist is going to immediately question the overabundance of data without the controls and without the reproducibility.
So let me respond to this idea that intelligent and expert trained scientists, if shown this data, might dismiss it for lack of more information on the controls. And here's where I've been saving the best information for last, for a sort of dramatic and controversial revelation. I've had three important scientists in the field of cancer research, contact me about my work. They have seen this data. They have seen all of our data.
this changes the conversation entirely. Suddenly, John's reputation is on the line.
I would never give that data out to another scientist. It wasn't controlled. That's highly inappropriate behavior that you did, that you actually went behind my back and you sent this to other researchers where I allowed you to use my credibility in my lab to do this work.
Okay, so here's my response. First of all, if there was some breach in protocol I made by sharing some preliminary data...
Why didn't you ask me? Why didn't you say, look, someone's contacting me. Do you mind if I share some of our data together?
Could I finish without being interrupted? If I broke some protocol, I apologize. You never told me, keep this data secret and don't show it to anybody. It just was given free.
Even though Anthony promises he didn't mention John's name to these other scientists, if one of those scientists were to do a quick Google search, in a few clicks he could get to John, who would then be associated with data he would never want public.
I'm sorry. It's to me as a composer, it's like, some violinist says, hey, do you have a piece for a violin? I say, well, I have a sketch. It's nothing really great, but I have a little star. Well, let me see what it is. Oh, sure, I'll send it along. So it's the same kind of thing. And, when people contacted me... You
didn't send it as a sketch, Anthony. You sent them data that is if we had done the proper controls. That's false advertising.
Jonathan, in one case... I met for hours with the director of a medical research hospital in the cancer division, and I explained to this doctor exactly what we did. She knew it was preliminary. She knew there were holes and things that had to be nailed down. She knew all the details of everything, looked at the data and said, yeah, let's go. Here's a 7-page contract. So I'm just saying...
I just wanted to be part of the conversation.
You asked me to respond. No scientist would take my preliminary data seriously. I'm sorry, that's wrong. And I think you need to make up your mind. Either the data, this preliminary data I have is not worthy of another scientist's consideration, or you're mad at me for showing it to another scientist who considered it worthy.
Anthony, we've had discussions, and you were mostly concerned with, like, look, I understand.
Finally, John and Anthony asked for time to talk alone, with no microphone. After a while, they made up, but it doesn't seem like they're going to be working together anytime soon. What it felt like to sit in that room, it felt like watching a couple break up, which I felt more sad about than I'd expected to. They were this odd pair it was fun to root for. And on top of that, I just felt like cancer. Anthony's father died of cancer. John's aunt died of cancer. My mom died of cancer. Why can't we just get rid of this already? I think out of the three of us, only John, who deals with it every day, had realistic expectations when he started these experiments with Anthony.
Even if you have a good idea
even if you have a potential sci-fi cure, it's just not that easy, you know? But if we want scientific breakthroughs, this is what it takes.
We are trying to have breakthroughs. We're just not succeeding most of the time.
Gabriel Rhodes. He's going to continue filming Anthony and John if either of them ever starts this research again. You can see clips from what he's filmed so far at thecuredocumentary.com. Coming up, trying something crazy, throwing a Hail Mary pass to solve a tough problem in your own personal life, a true story. That's in a minute from Chicago Public Radio and Public Radio International when our program continues.